All right, tonight is plug my headphones in. Tonight is it's November 30th, and it's a Thursday night, 9 p.m. So we're going to be studying natural philosophy at this time. And over the past couple nights, I'm sorry, I haven't really been paying attention to the names in attendance each night, so I'm not sure if all of you have been here night by night, but some of you have. But we've been going through the introduction to classical philosophy. We've done a lot of introductory stuff, and we're going to kind of bring that to an end tonight, and then from now on, we're just going to be digging into these works. But I'd like to take some time tonight to introduce natural philosophy, because even though it's natural philosophy and it seems like it's going to be pretty simple because we've studied science and stuff like that, I think this is actually the most difficult of the sciences because of the baggage that we bring into it. You know, it's we bring so much stuff into this that it takes a lot to purge that stuff, and so I want to talk about that a little bit before we get started, and then we're just going to get into the first chapter of Aristotle's Physics, and I prepared another one of those summaries of Thomas Aquinas's commentaries, so it'll be a simple little document that sort of summarizes Thomas's comments on the book. What I wanted before we get started, though, there's a couple of important issues I want to talk about. Hold on, I've still got new registrations coming in. Let me just approve these real quick. Probably all Gene's friends coming in here.
I'm trying.
Yeah, I'm just going to leave that to you. I'm just going to let you be the PR man, and I'm just going to keep working. Um, one thing I want to talk about is that something that confuses me and frustrates me is that the modern college and university system has a real negative effect on philosophical studies. It's a real source of confusion. And I can discern this, when I'm listening to people talk, what happens is I notice that, I sit here every day. This is my full-time job. I read Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, classical liberal arts, all the original sources and texts. It's my full-time job. I've been doing this for 25 years. And when I listen to people talk about these things, usually who have like academic connections in academic circles, what I notice is that the stuff that they talk about is not in these books. It's like a separate culture has developed where there's just like this culture of academic life where people go to college, they take philosophy classes, they learn ideas in philosophy classes, they learn lingo, they learn these different phrases and terms, and then they repeat them for their exams and on their papers and stuff like that. It's all this artificial um, lingo of the college classrooms. It doesn't come from these sources. So it's like this artificial college language. And the students learn that, they repeat it, they get their grades, and then they walk out of the class and they believe that they've studied those subjects, and they just go on to the next place and repeat all that stuff. And it's like this game of operator where they or a telephone where they just go around and repeat and copy and paste these college phrases and ideas that they learn, and really none of this stuff is coming from the sources. And I think this is one of the biggest obstacles for philosophical studies. Is there's just so much of this what I call textbook philosophy. It's students reading these things out of textbooks, reading anthologies in college classes, everything's always summarized. It's always explained by somebody else. No one actually reads the books. They just learn what the professor says. They ask, is this going to be on the test? Is that going to be on the test? The teacher gives them a study sheet to go over. And that's what they learn. And then they go out from those classes, whether they go into other classrooms in schools or they go into their own businesses in publishing or conference speaking or whatever. And they just go, and it's just this constant parroting of this textbook college classroom philosophy that really has nothing to do with classical philosophy. And that's a real obstacle. And I want to challenge you to examine yourself with this stuff and ask yourself, when you talk about philosophy, is your philosophy coming from the sources of philosophy, like the writings of Aristotle or the writings of Aquinas and the writings of Plato and so on? Or is it coming from, college classes, textbooks, anthologies, stuff like that? Because the problem, as we're going to see this when we get into the first chapter of physics, you can read through one of these chapters and you can step back from reading and say, all right, I think I understand this. Let me see if I got this right. And you'll sort of go through this effort of explaining what you think it says. And what you'll notice is that, let's say there's 12 sentences in the chapter. You might find that you can make sense out of 10 of them, but there's two that don't fit what you just explained. There's a sentence or two that you don't get. You don't understand what this line means. Your understanding is at best incomplete. And I'm not saying your, I'm saying our. Like when that happens, when we think we understand it, but we know that there's like a passage or a paragraph or a sentence that we really have no idea what that means after we've read it. That means that at best, our understanding is incomplete, but at worst, we're totally wrong. And it's possible that one sentence that we don't understand could be a sentence that actually is revealing to us that what we're thinking about this patch is just totally wrong. And we're missing the point. And that's one of the biggest problems. So as we get into the physics tonight, we're going to get into some of the most complicated, difficult stuff right off the bat, because Aristotle gets into things about, how we actually learn, how the philosophical process actually works. And this is not a simple issue. This is a fundamental issue that Plato and Aristotle disagreed on. So to go through this and just pretend like it's some simple, easy thing, and we just bounce on to the next chapter. I mean, this is the stuff that the greatest, wisest men in human history didn't agree on. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we go into the reading, we go into these lessons. We don't bring baggage with us from philosophy classes and stuff like that, but we read the text and make ourselves accountable to every single sentence in every single chapter. And if there's a sentence we don't understand, we've got to figure out what it means before we think we know what that chapter means, because that's the kind of thing that what happens is it starts out with, we don't understand one sentence and we start talking about it. The next thing we know, in the next chapter, there's two more sentences we don't understand. And by chapter 10, there's been 30 sentences that we didn't understand. And we're beginning to tell ourselves that we understand this. And there's these flashing red lights in every chapter that warn us we're not right. So I want us to have the kind of humility in these studies that Socrates had, where he didn't assume that he knew things, because this is very, very complicated. And it's good for us to know that. I mean, these are the things, like I said, Aristotle and Plato are wrestling with these things and they don't agree. So this isn't easy stuff. St. Thomas, fortunately, makes a lot more sense of it. And, he sort of shows us, assuming we trust St. Thomas, he shows us which of the two sides is, more in harmony with Catholic thought and is actually in agreement with divine revelation. And we'll look at a couple of quotes that show this later on. But I just want to make sure we all, sort of check previous knowledge that we bring into these studies and read the texts and make ourselves accountable to every line. Because I personally think that one of the reasons why I've had some success in these studies is because I was never impressed by the academic system, even though I was in it. I wasn't impressed by it. I didn't feel like my professors took the studies seriously enough personally to trust them. And, I would find things that they couldn't explain or things that they said that were contradicted in the readings. And I just kept digging and digging and digging. It's like translation in the original languages. We were talking about the Loeb classics the other night, and you'll see that the Loeb classics, some of the translations are funny because they don't even pretend to deal with the original language in some places. And you'll be looking at the original language and then look to the translation, and you can see that this translator didn't even make an effort to make sense of the words in the original language. He just assumed he knew what it was talking about and wrote down his interpretation with no reference to the actual words of the original language. And we do the same thing when we read philosophy. If we don't make ourselves accountable to the text and just say, oh, I think I understand what this means, and we just leap ahead, we're just not doing the actual work, which is to study these texts and make ourselves accountable to these teachings, because we don't know these things better than Aristotle. We don't understand them better than Aristotle. We're accountable to his teachings, and we've got to deal with the text. So I just want to say that as a warning, because the college system the whole thing is artificial. It's not real philosophy. The philosophy professors are not philosophers. And it just there's a lot of textbook information, textbook knowledge that we have to be conscious of and be willing to shed as we get into these studies. All right, so having said that, I want to share my screen here, and then we'll start getting into this stuff. The first document I want to share is the one I've shared this repeatedly now, a couple nights in a row, where I introduced to you an overview of philosophy. And this is not my own stuff. This is straight from St. Thomas Aquinas. I've simply deleted a lot of filler. So this is a distilled version of St. Thomas's explanation of what philosophy is, how philosophy is divided, and so on. Tuesday night, we talked about rational philosophy. Last night, we talked about moral philosophy. And tonight, we're going to talk about natural philosophy. So we're getting into the third of the four different sciences that St. Thomas says are necessary for us in the pursuit of wisdom. As for the definition of natural philosophy here, natural philosophy considers the order of things that human reason considers but does not establish. Natural philosophy considers the order of things that human reason considers but does not establish. In other words, natural philosophy studies things outside of us where there is an order established by the creator. We would say, as Christians, we would say by the creator. Aristotle would say by nature with a capital N. There's already an existing order, and we don't know what that order is. We have to learn that order by investigating it, by studying it. And that's what natural philosophy is, the study of the natural world, to understand the order that exists in the natural world, which is considered by us, but is not established by us. It already exists. Okay, that's natural philosophy. And we're just going to jump right into this. So when we look at this, as it says here, this is studied in Aristotle's Physics and Metaphysics. Okay, so we're going to jump into Aristotle's Physics here. The textbook that I study with the students in the academy is a translation of Aristotle's Physics by a guy named Thomas Taylor. Thomas Taylor was himself, as crazy as this might sound, Thomas Taylor was a Platonist who lived in England in the 1800s. He was like an old school philosopher. He was himself a Platonist living in the early 1800s in England. That's why he's actually good, because when he translates philosophical works, he translated all of the works of Plato. So just think about that. 55 dialogues. He translated all of them from Greek into English. So we have all of his translations of the dialogues of Plato, and he translated all the works of Aristotle. So we're talking about a guy who, has translated thousands of pages of Greek philosophy for us. And he's done much more than that. He's translated commentaries on Euclid's geometry, all kinds of stuff. What's valuable about Thomas Taylor is he understands and respects philosophy. He understands the ideas, he understands the vocabulary and the language. So when he translates it, it might feel clumsy sometimes. Most people don't like it because they just don't feel comfortable with it. But if you want to understand philosophy, Thomas Taylor is a safe translator, because when there's awkward places in his translation, there's a reason for it. Like there's something going on in the original language, and he's trying to show that in the English translation, not just, make it disappear by throwing his own ideas in there, or just, translating the idea rather than the words. So he's the best translator of Plato and Aristotle for those of us who are actually studying philosophy. So if someone randomly said, hey, you know, what do you recommend for me to read? I'd like to read Plato. I wouldn't recommend Thomas Taylor. I'd say just get some popular translation and read Plato's dialogues. But if you want to study philosophy, Thomas Taylor is the best translator. Having said that, you'll notice that in his book, he comments extensively on these passages. So Book 1, Chapter 1 of Aristotle, the larger text here is Aristotle's actual text translated. All of this small print are notes and comments by Thomas Taylor. And you'll see as you get to certain pages, 2/3 of the page is his commentary. You know, so the book may look intimidating, but hardly any of it actually needs to be read because most of it is his endless commentary. The reason why he writes so much commentary is because he had a theory. He had a theory that Aristotle was wrongly interpreted by scholasticism and that Aristotle actually agreed with Plato. So he spends a lot of time trying to explain how Aristotle's teaching really is the same as what Plato was saying. It's just got some, you know, twists to it. So when you see this, my advice to you is ignore all of the commentary. It's irrelevant. It's much better to let St. Thomas be your commentator if you're going to go anywhere for commentary. Read Aristotle's text because the translation is great, but ignore Taylor's commentary because he's just wrong, right? Aristotle's not a Platonist. Aristotle himself says that, and it's fun to read the passages where Aristotle makes it really clear he doesn't agree with Plato, and Taylor tries to explain it away. But don't be intimidated by these pages, because if you look at these pages, this is all you need to read. This is all Taylor down here, and most of the pages are like that. This is Aristotle. All of this is Taylor. So don't think that this book is as difficult as it appears. It's really not a lot of reading. Aristotle's chapters are pretty short, okay? So that's why I use Taylor for translations. And again, I know it's clumsy to read sometimes, but if you want to be careful learning philosophy, it's good to have it clumsy because he's very sensitive to the philosophical ideas in Aristotle's text and the original language. So this is chapter 1 of book 1 of the Physics. The Physics is Aristotle's exploration of the science of nature. Now, what's important for us to make sure we remember, and one of the things that, you know, as we study together, I'm just going to beat on and beat on and beat on is the need to read this and always remember the context. Remember the historical context. Remember the philosophical context of Aristotle's work, because if you lose sight of the context, you can just go off the rails in 1,000 different ways. You've got to keep Aristotle in context. You've got to remember that this science of physics did not exist before Aristotle. He's the one who figured it out. He's the author of the science of nature as far as physical science goes, philosophically speaking. He developed this. This is the fruit of his own investigation and work, and he organized it into an entire system of scientific knowledge. What he gives us it's just impossible to explain, you know, how valuable it is what he gave us. But he's not pulling this from other sources. This wasn't taught previously, and he's just sort of collecting it like many other philosophers did through history. He's revealing this as as his original teaching and research on the science of nature. And we've got to remember that. Secondly, we've got to remember where this came from, how he came up with this. He discovered the science or the art of demonstrative reasoning. He figured out the instrument, and then he applied that instrument to the problems of the philosophical sciences and used that instrument of demonstrative reasoning, which we're going to study in classical reasoning. He then used the method that he himself discovered to establish the physical sciences or the philosophical sciences. So really, in context, this is all crazy if you think about what he's doing. It's like when we read history and we say, well, you know, Newton couldn't figure out the physics, so what did he do? his math really wasn't sufficient for the problems and the complexity. So what did he do? He invents calculus, right? Like, how convenient. Let's just invent a mathematical science and then apply it to, attempt to. That's what Aristotle was doing, except it was the art of reasoning itself that he developed, not just some, more obscure mathematical science. So this is all extraordinary content at an extraordinary moment in human history, in philosophical history. And we've just got to keep that in context. Aristotle is writing in a Platonic society where Plato dominates the philosophical culture. And Aristotle, with this demonstrative reasoning as his method, is disagreeing with Plato and is demonstrating that Plato's wrong and that his interpretation is necessary and true. So we've got to remember that he demonstrates lots and lots of stuff that we don't necessarily need to have demonstrated. You're going to see this in the following chapters, where he goes on this long explanation of the whole history of natural philosophy, where all of these other philosophers have tried to explain these things. He goes through all their different opinions, all their different explanations, and proves all of them wrong. And none of us hold any of those positions. So you can read through it, if you're curious, but we're just going to skip all that stuff because he's dealing with unique problems in his historical context that in our context don't even exist. There's nobody living today who says that there's one element in the natural world and it's fire. We don't have to deal with that. Or there's not another school of scientists who say, no, it's water. We just don't have to deal with that. But they did at that time. We have different issues. We're going to have to deal with issues like, is it really true that there are, let's say, 109 chemical elements, right? And the chemical elements on the periodic table, is that the same thing as the 4 elements that Aristotle's going to talk about? Was Aristotle wrong? Was he like this ignorant hillbilly who thought that there were just four elements and he didn't understand that gold and silver were different substances? Was he was that stupid that he didn't understand? Or maybe that's not what he means when he's talking about elements. So we have some interesting modern questions and problems to dig into, like things like that, like the number of elements. But a lot of these ancient philosophical problems, they're just not around anymore. We don't, no one holds some of these crazy ideas, right? Although, they're becoming popular again through some sources, like modern science getting into atomic theory and atomism and stuff like that. I mean, that's just a revival of ancient natural philosophy that Aristotle destroys in the physics. So there's a lot of interesting modern stuff to get into, which I'll leave for appropriate places, but some of this stuff is just not relevant anymore. These things haven't been taught for thousands of years, literally, and there are some passages we just need to skip. So let's just, as we study, try to constantly go back and remember the context of this, understanding who Aristotle was, what he was doing, how revolutionary this stuff was, and the fact that he's presenting this, and demonstrating it for the first time. So sometimes things are a little confusing, maybe not well presented, but you've got to keep it in context. All right. For chapter 1, it's a very short chapter. There's nothing really difficult about reading it, but as we get through it, you're just going to see that he's talking about stuff that we don't understand, right? He's talking about some ideas that we're going to have to figure out, because this is not common sense stuff. And that's what I want to try to spend my time talking about tonight, to make this clear. But we're just going to read it real quick. So bear with me as I read through this, just so we're familiar with the text, and then we'll dig into it a little bit. So this is chapter 1 of book 1 of Aristotle's Physics. Since about all methods, I'll zoom in here a little bit, hold on. Since about all methods of which there are principles or causes or elements, it happens that we obtain knowledge and science from the knowledge of these. For we think that we know anything when we know the first causes and the principles of it, and as far as to the elements from which it is composed. This being the case, it is evident that we should first endeavor to define these things which pertain to the principles of the science concerning nature. But the natural path in which we should proceed is from things more known and manifest to us to things which are more manifest and known to nature. For that which is known to us is not the same with that which is simply known. Hence it is necessary to proceed after this manner from things more obscure to nature, but which are more manifest to us, to things more manifest and known to nature. To us, however, things which are more confused are at first evident and clear, but afterwards, from these to those who divide them, the elements and principles become known. On this account, it is necessary to proceed from universals to particulars, for the whole is more known according to sense, and that which is universal is a certain whole, since it comprehends many things as parts. Names also are after a certain manner thus affected with respect to definition, for they signify a certain whole, and this indefinitely, as for instance a circle. But definition divides it into several parts. Children also, at first, call all men fathers, and all women mothers, but afterwards they distinguish each of these. So that's the text of chapter 1. And you can imagine when I've got teenage kids reading through that, they panic because they have no idea what this is talking about. And it's true because, remember, this science, and this is why I say you've got to keep it in context. This science is being developed after he's already established and taught the reasoning, right? He's already taught the system of reasoning, and he's labeled it the instrument. So he's assuming we already understand the things that have been taught in reasoning. And now he's just putting that thing to work here. So he's assuming the knowledge of some things that his students would know, but that none of us know unless we've studied classical reasoning already. And that's why this is difficult to understand. So what I want to do is just walk through this again and explain some of these ideas in a simple way, just as an overview, and then we'll go and look at the summary of what St. Thomas has to say and get into it a little more deeply. So let's just go back to the top here. So right up front, he says, we're talking about a science here. We're trying to understand this subject of nature in a philosophical or a scientific way. And remember that by science, he means a systematic knowledge where everything in that science, everything in that system is certain. So we're not just doing Socratic dialogue. We're not getting, probable ideas. We're not running with the most, with the consensus or anything like that. We're trying to really nail down absolute truth here by means of demonstrative reasoning. We're trying to establish a science of the natural world, to know the order that exists in nature outside of us, right? Like we said before. So about all methods, and that word methods is the word science, about all methods of which there are principles or causes or elements. Now, when we see that, we have a sense that we know what that means. We know what principles, causes, and elements. They're like the basic building blocks, right? So we think that we understand something when we can break it down into its parts and study and examine the parts. And we call that analysis. And then after we've studied all the parts and broken things down as far as we can break them down and understand all their component parts, then we can reassemble it, which is called synthesis. We can reassemble it, and then we can look at it again with a knowledge of all of its parts. And that's when we think we know that thing. A good example of this would be a car, right? If you look at a car and you ask a kid or even an adult to draw a car, they'll draw like the shape of the body and the wheels. And once you get past that, it gets very fuzzy. We really don't know much about the cars. We think we do, but we really don't. And that becomes manifest when we have to draw one. And then you look at like a mechanical draftsman's schematic drawing of an automobile, where he's got every part of the car exploded, right? And every piece labeled and numbered. You can picture that schematic drawing, the transmission all opened up, all the parts and gears and shafts labeled and named. You think of that schematic drawing and you say, that's analysis, right? That's knowledge, that's science. So when that engineer says car, that's what he thinks. The word car signifies that schematic drawing and all of the science behind it, all of the different parts and movements and the ends for which every different part exists, how the whole thing works, what the human role in that machine is. He's got that whole entire system in his head broken down to every individual nut, bolt, screw, wire, everything, right? And he can sit on the side of the road and watch a car go by, just like the little kid does. But that little kid and the engineer see two totally different things. One of them has science and the other doesn't, okay? So when he says here, concerning all methods or sciences of which there are principles or causes or elements, we obtain knowledge and science from the knowledge of these building blocks, right? But principles, causes, and elements is a little more complicated, right? Because these are three different kinds of things. And St. Thomas explains this, okay? Elements, we kind of have a sense of this because of chemistry. We talk about the chemical elements, which again aren't, you can't just drag these things into each other, but we have a general idea of what elements are from chemistry. They're like material building blocks. We consider the material cause of something, all right? The material cause is an element. Then we've got principles, which you may know this referred to as the efficient cause, right? The agent, or the one who directs and causes motion in a thing, or causes something to do what it does. That's what's meant here by a principle. And then the causes are the other two causes. Okay, so principles, causes, and elements. I didn't make that up. St. Thomas explains that and proves it, of course. But so when he says principles, causes, and elements, he's not just like throwing out a handful of synonyms, just because it makes the rhythm of the sentence sound nice. Those are actually three different things in Aristotle's mind. And St. Thomas explains that for us, okay? So when we know the causes of things, that's what he's saying. When we know the causes of things, and if you're new to classical philosophy, you don't know what the causes are yet, we'll study them in the future. So don't worry about that. You're not supposed to bring any knowledge to this anyway. But he's talking about the four causes in classical philosophy. And he says, when we know these, that's when we really sense that we know something and understand it. And if you can't identify the causes, then you don't actually know it, even if you imagine you do or claim you do. And that's why in the Metaphysics, Aristotle says we can tell someone knows something by his ability to teach it. And when he says his ability to teach it, he means his ability to demonstrate it, to actually prove it and explain it in light of its causes. All right, so that's what it means to know something scientifically. The engineer, if you ask the child, how does a car work? He'll give you some details. Well, mommy turns the key and steps on the gas and she puts it in gear and then, well, yeah, okay, that's true, but that's not science, right? We're not getting to the causes. The engineer can go all the way. He can go all the way to all four causes and explain everything that's going on. That's science, okay? He can teach that. So that's one example of a scientific knowledge. And then he says in parentheses here, we think we know something when we know the first causes and the first principles of it, and as far as to the elements from which it is composed. So when we can break it down until it can't be broken down anymore, and then we can understand all of the parts at that principal level, that primary level, and then reconstruct the whole thing through synthesis, that's when we say, yeah, I understand this thing, okay? I understand this. And you can see when you think like that, how many subjects do any of us know like that, right? That knowledge is very, very rare for us to have that kind of science. Maybe about one specialty we focus our whole life on. Like I can say my knowledge of the 7 liberal arts is getting pretty close to scientific as far as a curriculum is concerned. But, it's usually so difficult to come to that kind of knowledge that we have to specialize and commit our whole life to just one thing. That's how difficult it is. So it's hard for us to gain scientific knowledge about multiple subjects unless we start with the most universal principles, which ultimately direct everything inferior to them. And that's why the wise man kind of knows all things, right? He who has the highest science actually possesses to some degree all of the sciences. And we'll get into that in metaphysics. But I think that's pretty clear what he's saying here. So just understand that principles, causes, and elements, it's not just some random words he chose to use. They're 3 different things. And it's pretty easy for us to understand what he's saying. We think we know something when we can break it down in our mind to its elements and causes and principles, understand how it works from that level, and then reconstruct it. That's when we feel like we know something. And so he says, if that's the case and our subject here is nature, then we're going to have to get after the principles of the natural world. So we're going to have to try to figure out what are the elements of the natural world? What are the principles? What are the causes of the natural world? We're going to have to figure that out. And this is something that philosophers argued about for centuries and centuries and centuries, and they had all kinds of crazy ideas. You can imagine the kind of stuff they might come up with. Some of them would say, and like I mentioned before, some said that water is the principle and everything is derived from water. Some would say, no, it's fire. Some would say, no, it's water and fire. Another philosopher would say, no, it's numbers. Another philosopher would say, no, it's actually love and strife. Those are the elements from which all. So you get all kinds of wacky explanations and attempts to try to identify the elements. But what Aristotle does is says none of these philosophers had the instrument at his disposal. None of these philosophers had the instrument of demonstrative reasoning, and we can easily demonstrate why all of their explanations are impossible and positively prove what the truth is and establish true science. And that's what he's going to do in the physics. All right, so I think that's pretty clear, that first page. Now he moves on to a second question. So he says, okay, we're going to need to get after the principles. We're going to need to figure out what the elements are, what the causes are in the natural world. Now the second question is, how in the world should we do this? How should we go about this? And this is where Plato and Aristotle disagreed. And I'm going to show you some quotes in a minute from the Summa. But this is where they disagreed. So Platonism and Aristotelianism take 2 different routes at this point. When we get to the question of how should we proceed, how should we pursue this knowledge of the principles and causes and elements of the natural world, Plato said we need to go to the spiritual realm, right? We need to get to the forms, to the ideas, to the ideals. That's where we need to begin, and then come back down to the natural world. Aristotle disagreed with that and said, no, that's not how our minds work. We don't work by going to the abstract first. We ascend to the abstract by going through the material. So the process that we need to take, the path we need to take to figure this out is we need to start by observation. We need to start with the things that are, like he says here, known and manifest to us. You see that phrase? Known and manifest to us. That is, as human beings, as physical, material beings, we need to begin from the things that are known and manifest to us, the things that we can observe, and through them ascend to the things, and this is a weird phrase, this is what the kids get hung up on, ascend to things that are more manifest and known to nature. Okay, that phrase is just one of these clumsy philosophical phrases. But remember, that word nature, it's good to put a capital N on it, because remember that this is not a Christian book. If this was written by a Christian, the language would probably be different, right? I think it's best if we say we ascend from things that are known and manifest to us as humans who learn through our senses, and from them or through them to ascend to things which are more manifest and known to God himself, right? So I don't know if you've heard this. It's a cheesy illustration that like every Protestant pastor gives at some point in his sermon, but he talks about how, a kid will be sitting on the floor and his grandmother's like, doing some cross stitch or something, and the kid's looking up at the bottom of the cross stitch and it's just a big mess. But from the top, the grandmother's looking at the actual, design that she's stitching. And then she turns it around and shows the child, and the child understands what is going on. But what he sees is not the reality of what's being done. If you think about that idea, what we see is not actually the truth. What we see is, it's fallen, it's decaying, it's changing, there's corruption, there's all kinds of human artificial problems that have been invented and imposed on things we see. So when we look around, we don't see the world as it exists in the mind of God. We see it in this corrupt, constantly changing, fallen state. Nevertheless, through contemplation, we can examine the natural world and move past it, right? We understand it's fallen, we understand it's corrupt. We don't allow those things to distract us. We take, for example, we read the book of Genesis and we read, God saw everything that he created, and behold, it was all very good. So it's that image of the natural world that we have to try to gain hold of. And the way that we do it is by observing the things that are around us and then using our imagination to move from them to a more perfect, what Aristotle would call a phantasm. We'll just say an imagination of what they are in their perfect form. So we have intellectual work to do, not just to observe and report as if that's the reality, but to understand that what we observe is not the reality. It's just the current state of things. And to go through it by means of contemplation, to actually think about and imagine what the ideal is that can be seen through the things that are made, through the things that we actually can perceive around us. So that's the work of contemplation. Aristotle says that's the way to get to the truth. We have to go through the material things, through the visible things, through the sensible things. We can't do this nonsense that Plato talks about, where we just leapfrog all of that and pretend we're all contemplative and ignore the material world around us, because we're accountable to this material world. This is the reality. What we see is the reality, but it's not perfect. And therefore, we need to simply look through it through contemplation, imagine the ideals, and then from them, because they're tied to the actual realities, and we can be sure that they're right because they're connected to the realities. We're not just making up random craziness like ancient philosophers did. It's a more sure path to go through the sensible world and ascend to the abstract world of truth, which we're trying to understand, which is where the real science is, the science of natural philosophy. So that's where Platonism and Aristotle diverge, and it leads to two completely different methods, two completely different outcomes. Plato comes up with the idea of the forms, where there are these real, patterns of everything that exists in the natural world, and you get into all that stuff, and that those patterns are real. Aristotle says, no, those patterns are not actually existing outside of our minds, right? They're not actually existing. We understand them. We put words on them. We can understand them by contemplation, but they don't actually exist outside of us. And that's the difference between Platonism and Aristotelianism in a nutshell. So that's what he's getting at here. So when he says the path through which we should proceed, I realize this is radical stuff in his day. He's saying we're not going to go the route that Plato goes. We're not going to think about this like Plato, which is crazy in 350 BC. we're going to take a different path. I'm going to take you on a different path. We're going to go and start with the things that are known to us, the things that we see here. But we're going to go through them, and I'm going to lead you through them, and then we're going to proceed to those things which are more manifest and known to capital N nature, as if the things that God himself understands and thinks of when he looks at the world, when he says, behold, all is very good. That world that God designed and sees, we're going to ascend to that world by means of the visible world. So it's the process that we're going to take that separates the two philosophies. And he goes on, hence it's necessary to proceed after this manner from things that are more obscure to nature, right? Things that really aren't the things that capital N nature thinks of or looks at when it looks at the world, but which are more manifest to us looking from this side, from the bottom up, and to then ascend to things which are more manifest and actually see them as nature sees them or as God sees them. To us, however, things which are confused are evident and clear. And this seems to be a contradiction, right? To us, things which are confused are at first evident and clear, but it's very simple. By confused here, he means just together in a whole without any distinction, like the child looking at a car, right? The child looks at a car and it's just like all the parts and stuff are just all kind of meshed together under the body of the car. The kid doesn't understand the details. It's just, there's a bunch of junk inside the car. It's a confused whole that he sees, that he perceives. Whereas again, the engineer sees something different, but for the kid, yeah, the motor's like in there and there's all this other stuff and there's wheels and stuff, but it's just a confused whole. That's what we see naturally, ignorantly. That's the common sense view of natural things. We see them confused. That's what confused means, but evident and clear because we observe them, right? We can see them, we can smell, touch, taste, hear them, and so on. They're evident and clear to us, but the form that we see them in is a confused and indiscriminate whole that we see. Okay, because what we've got to do to understand is we've got to take it apart and understand all of its parts and all of the causes and principles and so on. What's manifest and known to us initially is a confused mass of stuff that we don't understand. Maybe we don't even pay attention to or observe because we don't think it's important. That's what's evident and clear to us at first. But afterwards, notice what it says here, to those who divide them, to those who take that confused whole and break it down into its component parts. And we're not just talking about physical parts, we're also talking about causes and these other things. Those who break them down understand all of the component parts, all the causes of them. That's what it means to understand it as nature would understand it. Afterwards, to those who divide them, the elements and the principles become known. On this account, it's necessary to proceed from universals, that is, whole things, right, the confused wholes, to particulars. That's the method we need to pursue. For the whole is more known according to sense, that is, our senses perceive the wholes, and that which is universal is a certain whole, since it comprehends many things, it contains many things, or is composed of many things as parts. And then he gets into a couple of examples here, which it's funny because to him, these are clarifying examples. And to most students, it's like, I thought I was following, and these two examples, now I feel like I have no clue what he's talking about. He says, names also are after a certain manner, thus affected with respect to definition, for names signify a certain whole, and this indefinitely. And the kids are just like, what in the world? That was clear up to that line. Now I'm lost. What he's saying here, again, this goes back to classical reasoning. A name is a whole because the name is a representation of a definition. And if we think about what a definition is, if we study reasoning, a definition is the statement of the genus of that thing and then of the difference. that separates it from all other members of that genus. That's what a definition is. So for example, the definition of man, the name man is a whole. It's a confused whole. We don't know the parts of it. We just know the word man, and we use the word man. But if I say define man, we'll get 20 different definitions from an ignorant crowd of people. To define man, we've got to identify the genus to which man belongs. So we'll say animal. So now we've identified the genus that man belongs to of all other created things. And now we've got this genus with all of these different animals, but that genus is divided into different species. And we've got to ask, what is it that causes man to differ from all the other animals? And we've got to identify what's called the specific difference that separates man from all the other animals in that genus. And that specific difference is rational. So we'll say man is a rational animal. That's the definition. It identifies the genus, animal, and the specific difference, which is rational. So man as a name is like a symbol in Aristotle's example of a confused whole that we use, but we can't identify the parts. When we learn the definition of man and we understand what it actually means, we say man is a rational animal. We now understand the causes of what man is. So we no longer think of the name man as that ignorant blob of a name. We now hear the name man, and we think of the definition and understand its parts in the same way that an engineer thinks of a car and understands its parts. And then the same thing, he gives this illustration with children, where children can recognize the figure of a man and call it father, because the only man that he knows is his father, and he can't distinguish between individual men or different men yet. And he calls all women mothers, again, because he can't distinguish. But afterwards, when he learns the actual qualifications of what it is that separates his mother from other women, he can then distinguish and know not to call any woman mother if he sees her at a distance, for example. Okay. So that's the end of chapter 1. I think it's pretty clear, but like I said, you have to sort of know Aristotle to understand Aristotle. That's what's difficult about it. And what I always tell students is just be patient, right? You've got to read through it. You've got to read through all the works of Aristotle and then cycle back and reread them all and allow Aristotle to explain Aristotle. So that's the content of chapter 1. Just to give you this other document, because I know we're out of our time here. What I did here on this document, and I'll give you a quick link. One sec. In the chat. This link here is a summary of St. Thomas's commentary on that first chapter. Okay. He goes into some other preliminary issues. You'll see that up top here. He talks about 3 different branches of science. But then I think I have faithfully explained what he explains here. He just, goes into more detail. And sometimes I think it's less helpful only because he's so stinking brilliant that sometimes you get lost in his thoughts, because he's running ahead of Aristotle, which creates new problems. But I think if you read through that document on your own, you'll see that I explained just about everything he mentions. One thing I do want to add, I'm sorry, I know we're close to time, but you see what he says here is there are 3 different sciences which relate to the natural world: metaphysics, mathematics, and physics. This is really important. Most of us have heard of metaphysics, and now we've heard of physics usually in modern science context, which really has nothing to do with classical physics. But mathematics is a whole different world, and we talked about this Monday night. But notice what he says: metaphysics deals with things which do not depend upon matter. So they have nothing to do with the material world. They don't depend on matter for their existence or for their definitions. And examples of metaphysical subjects would be being itself, God, substance, and so on, right? These are metaphysical subjects. Physics deals with things that do depend on matter for their existence. They exist in the material world. And their definition also is dependent on material things. But mathematics are weird because mathematical things, and you see, this is a foreign idea. Mathematical things are things that depend upon matter for their existence. In other words, for a line to exist, it's got to take on a body. It's got to become a physical body. So, we would draw it as an illustration, but its definition, what it actually is not dependent on that physical representation. It doesn't have to exist physically to be defined and understood and talked about. So mathematics is like a middle of the way between physics and metaphysics, and that's why Pythagoras said mathematics is how you become philosophical. It's like a halfway route between the physical and the metaphysical. So if you're ever curious why you get all this crazy mathematical philosophy in the ancient world, it's because of this. They saw mathematics as this weird hybrid that was like in between the physical and the supernatural. And it's a good place to start to ascend to the supernatural. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention. As for St. Thomas, real quick here, down at the bottom of the page, I gave you a few quotes from the Summa. And I show you what I mentioned before, that St. Thomas explains this, that at this point, we have differing opinions from Plato and Aristotle. So you can read his explanation of that. But he talks about this process by which we come to know things. And this is a difference between Aristotelian philosophy and Platonist philosophy. So realize, in church history, when Aristotelianism becomes like the official philosophy of the church, the method of learning is recognized to be different than it was understood to be before scholasticism. And that's significant. If you know about the patristics, their approach to learning was Platonist, right? They believe that the way you come to know is by removing yourself from the material world and trying to ascend into the spiritual world by prayer or by reading scripture, right? By just bypassing everything material. And so you get this patristic mystical Christianity where they seek to know the truth by means of prayer and sort of waiting for grace to reveal things to you. Scholasticism comes and says, no, that's actually not right. That's not the way to contemplate. That's not the path to contemplation. And it's pretty significant that the Dominican order, just to kind of toot the horn of the Dominican order here, the Dominican order was basically like the implementation of the Aristotelian method to the spiritual life, right? You've got, like, from Saint Bernard back, you've got this patristic, Platonic, old way of truth seeking. And from St. Thomas, or really even before that, like St. Dominic forward, you've got this scholastic Aristotelian approach to truth seeking and contemplation. And you've got this exploding Dominican order. That's what's going on in the church. This philosophy is changing the way that Catholics approach truth. Not that they denied what the church fathers did, they simply expanded on it and added, philosophical study, reasoning, and so on to the pursuit of truth. So it's not a contradiction, it's an expansion upon what was done before. So anyway, that's all that I wanted to share tonight. I hope that's helpful. I think it's helpful, but I want to stop this recording so we can put an end to that, and then we're